Hello, everyone. Hey, we're back again with the History Symposium, and we're trying something new. We find that we have a lot of people wanting to present topics of their choosing, and then also we have so many on our list, our target list. We can't hope to get to all of them in the live streaming sessions, and quite frankly, the live streams take up a lot of time promoting them, preparing for them. So we thought we would start a new series. We're calling it Open Mic, and that's an opportunity for someone to pitch a topic to us, and Chris and I can host them by recording it, and then we'll upload it to the website and then communicate once that's available. So we're going to start this series off with Chris McKay, my co-host on so many of our talks, and Chris has a topic that he loves to talk about, and that is the First Regiment of Foot, or the Royal Scots, and then their experiences in the War of 1812. So I'll turn this over to Chris.
Thanks, Tom. Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us again today. Thank you also to Tom and Heritage Days for having me to speak on, as Tom said, one of my favorite topics, the First Regiment of Foot, or the Royal Scots, focusing mainly on the War of 1812. Now, before we begin today, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Attawandaron, and Wendat peoples. This part of London, Ontario, where I'm from, was part of Treaty 6 in 1796, signed with the Chippewa peoples. Today, there are many First Nation communities in my area, including Chippewa the Thames Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation. And in addition, there are many Indigenous people that call London their home. So I would like to take the time to acknowledge the historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples endure in Canada. Our organization accepts responsibility to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our own teaching and learning. To give you a little idea of where I'm going to go with my talk today, this is a bit of an overview. I'm going to start with some background to the topic and also a little bit of brief info about me. And then I'll continue with a really short overview of the early history of the regiment, starting in the early 17th century and taking us to the end of the 18th century. Now, in the early 19th century, the First Regiment actually had 4 battalions, and they served all around the world. So I'm going to take a quick look at those battalions. But the focus, of course, will be on the 1st Battalion serving in the Canadas in the War of 1812. So we're going to spend most of our time there. And then finally, I'm going to conclude by looking at the regiment today and wrapping up sort of that way. Now, to begin with, I've been reenacting the Royal Scots in the War of 1812 for approximately 20 years. And I think many reenactors would agree with me when I say that even though we've never actually served in the regiment that we portray, we do feel a certain attachment and an esprit de corps towards our chosen impression. So I and the people I serve with in the Royal Scots have spent a lot of the last 20 years trying to research the regiment and the men that served in it as well. Now, sometimes this esprit de corps, or this connection with our regiment, leads us to a bit of a friendly rivalry between reenacting groups. And that leads me to my theme for today. In the fall of 2020, Tom did an excellent talk on the prisoners of the 41st Regiment, specifically after the Battle of the Thames. And as an aside, I'd like to say it was an excellent talk, and it's on this YouTube channel as well. I highly recommend you go back and check that out if you haven't seen it already. At the conclusion of that talk, though, he was asked whether the 41st was considered an elite regiment. And he answered that question, obviously, but he also made an offhand remark about the Royal Scots, and it kind of got my mind spinning a little bit, thinking about that same question. Was the 1st Regiment considered an elite regiment in the Army in the early 19th century? Now, I would argue both yes and no, but that's going to be kind of the overall theme of my talk. So I'm going to return to that question throughout. Now, before I continue, I should discuss the name of the regiment. Over the nearly 400 years of the regiment's history, it does change names probably dozens of times. So sometimes you'll hear me talk of the 1st Regiment, sometimes the Royal Scots, and sometimes I'll simply use the term the Royals. I'm trying to use the appropriate term that they would have used at the time, but rest assured I'm always talking about the same regiment. And one further thing that I wanted to mention is I've spoken about the 4 battalions. So I'm going to come back to what that term battalion means, but all those different groups, all those different bodies make up the regiment that is the Royal Scots. So when we're looking at our question of whether the Royal Scots deserve the title of elite, we're going to go back and start at the beginning. In March of 1633, King Charles I authorized Sir John Hepburn of Scotland to raise 1,200 men for service in France. Now, initially, these men were mostly drawn from independent companies, and in fact, those independent companies dated back for some time. But as the regiment grew over the next 2 years, it was mostly new recruits. So this is where we date the history of the regiment from. As was common at the time, in France, the regiment was called the Regiment de Hébron, which is a Gallicized version of the name Hepburn, but it was also unofficially known as the Royal Scots. So it's important to realize that by the War of 1812, the Royal Scots as a regiment were over 175 years old. Many of the regiments they served with, though, were barely 60 years old. And so already we've got this kind of marker that, yeah, that suggests that they were an elite regiment. Served in Europe, serving under 3 different colonels, and they completely avoided Cromwell and the New Model Army in the United Kingdom. In 1653, Lord George Douglas, the Earl of Dumbarton, was named colonel. That's him pictured there. Now, I only mention that because for the next approximately 3 centuries, the regimental march of the Royal Scots was called Dumbarton's Drums. So that's where that name comes from. Lord Dumbarton was colonel in 1661 when the regiment returned to Britain for the first time in nearly 30 years. They've been serving the continent that whole time. Now, King Charles II, here, when he was restored to the English throne in 1660, he faced a bit of a problem. He had to disband the New Model Army of Oliver Cromwell, obviously, but that left him without a standing army of his own, and Parliament was not overly keen to provide him money to raise a new one. But he was permitted to raise 3 regiments of foot guards, and those are the 3 same regiments that you see today at Buckingham Palace, for example. But in the meantime, while he was working to raise these 3 regiments, the Royal Scots were recalled to the UK, and they were used throughout the country to combat uprisings and that sort of thing. So many, to this day in the regiment, claim that the Royal Scots were actually taken on strength by Charles II before the Foot Guards. So certainly that's a claim for elite status, if ever there was one. In 1886, the regiment raised the 2nd Battalion, and the regiment continued to have 2 full battalions until 1949. Now, I mentioned earlier that I was going to come back to what that difference meant between a battalion and a regiment. So in the British Army, most battalions, most regiments in the early 19th century were made up of more than 1 battalion. But the battalion is sort of the core of the regiment. So even though these 2 battalions were both Royal Scots battalions, they served separately, they had their own administration, that sort of thing. So the Royal Scots continued to have 2 full battalions until 1949, as I said, which was far longer than any other regular regiment. Both these battalions served with Marlborough in the early 18th century, but it was the 2nd Battalion that fought against Bonnie Prince Charlie at Culloden in 1746. And I love the Morier print pictured there of the Battle of Culloden. The 2nd Battalion also fought with Lord Amherst at the capture of Louisbourg in 1758 and Ticonderoga in 1759. Now, the Royal Scots didn't really take much of a part in the American War for Independence. They did fight against the French in the West Indies or the Caribbean, but that was about as close to America as they got during that conflict. Turning now to the early 19th century, in 1801, Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent, was named colonel of the regiment, which was an honorary title. And this is a picture of the Duke of Kent in the uniform of the Royal Scots. Now, the Duke of Kent is famous today for being the father of Queen Victoria. He was also the son of King George III and the younger brother of the Prince Regent, who would go on to become George IV. So having a royal as an honorary colonel, the Royal Scots were the only regiment other than the 60th Regiment to do so. And again, certainly a claim for elite status. And this is added to by the fact that the Duke of Kent took a keen interest in his regiment. And when his officers were serving in the UK, he regularly met with them and even asked them to consider him a friend. So if they got into trouble, they could come to him for help. It was also during the Duke of Kent's tenure that the name of the regiment officially changed to the Royal Scots in 1812. Previously, it had been known as the Royal Regiment. The 4th Battalion, and of any regiment apart from the 60th or Royal Americans. All 4 battalions were to see action in different theaters, but this is where we start to question whether the upper echelons of the British Army consider this an elite regiment. The 1st Battalion was sent to the West Indies in 1801, not exactly a nice posting, and they would spend more than a decade there before being sent directly to Quebec. The 2nd Battalion, after fighting in Egypt in 1801, was sent to India in 1807, and they would spend more than 2 decades there. So again, not a particularly nice posting. Skipping the 3rd Battalion for a moment, the 4th Battalion was mainly a holding battalion, so they stayed in Great Britain for most of the early 19th century before being sent to the siege of Bergen op Zoom in Holland in 1814. And from there, they were sent to join their 1st Battalion brothers in Canada, though they would spend the remainder of the War of 1812 just stationed in Quebec. They didn't see any action there. Now, turning to the 3rd, themselves, they fought with the main body of British troops in the early 19th century in Portugal, Spain, and France. In 1809, they retreated with Sir John Moore to Corunna, but they were soon back in action at Walcheren. And after that disastrous campaign, it was incredibly fever-ridden island. After that, they returned to Spain through Wellesley, who we know today as the Duke of Wellington. That was his later title. Under Wellington, they fought at Busaco in 1810, Fuente de Honor in 1811, Salamanca in 1812, Vitoria, San Sebastian, and the River Nive in 1813. And in 1814, just before Napoleon's surrender, the battalion fought their final action of the campaign outside the walls of Bayonne. Now, I want to note before we move on that in all these actions, the 1st Regiment fought well, and they received commendations from commanders and battle honors, but there's no indication at all that they were afforded any sort of elite status within the Army. They fought in the 5th Division of the Army throughout these campaigns, and they were consistently used as a dependable, though perfectly ordinary battalion. Interestingly, the regimental records state that the Light Company of the Royal Scots of this 3rd Battalion were the first Allied unit to enter France in 1813 and the last British unit to leave France in August 1814. I can't find any evidence, though, that that was deliberately done. They didn't choose the 1st Regiment to be the first into France. Rather, it seems to be merely a coincidence. In March, and this initiated another campaign known as the 100 Days. And in April, it was decided to again send the 3rd Battalion to the continent. On the 16th of June, the Royal Scots were heavily engaged at the Battle of Quatre Bras, and on the 18th at the Battle of Waterloo. Again, they were praised for their steadiness, especially Quatre Bras, where the 5th Division bore the brunt of the fighting, at least for the British. Again, though, there appears to be no effort on the part of the command staff to treat the Royals as a leader in any way special. To give you an example, the Guards regiments and the various battalions of the Guards that served at Waterloo were asked to hold Hougoumont on the right of Wellington's line. And today that's seen as a special posting for the Guards. They were given that, they were trusted with that position because of their status. Whereas the Royal Scots were just an ordinary battalion in the main battle line. They weren't given any special treatment. So now we turn to our main topic. The first Battalion Royal Scots left the West Indies, or the Caribbean. Remember, they've been serving there for a decade. And they were sent straight to Quebec in Lower Canada, and they arrived there in August of 1812. And this is a nice print of Quebec from a little bit later, but it kind of gives you an idea of what the site would have looked like when they arrived. So unfortunately, the 1st Battalion, due to being sent straight from the fever-ridden Caribbean or islands, they were unfit for duty for several months. So they were basically just stationed in Quebec, recovering for the first several months of the war. And the first action in 1812 was the Battle of Sackett's Harbor in May of 1813. But only 25 men from the regiment participated, as the Grenadier Company was ordered to join that attack, but the orders reached them too late. So they marched to the boats, but the boats were already gone by the time they arrived there. Overall, the attack on this harbor was a failure. There were some successes, but another attempt was made in July with 250 men of the regiment, but that attack was called off before it even began. Now, after July, for the remainder of the summer, the regiment was mostly split up, which will become a common theme. This was very common in the Canadas in the War of 1812, that a battalion would actually be split up amongst its companies and they would be posted in various places. So they were split up for the rest of the summer, but mostly they were stationed on the Niagara Peninsula, particularly around Fort George. You can see Fort George at the north end of the Niagara River there on the map. The Americans had captured Fort George in May of 1813, but after the Battle of Stony Creek, they limited themselves to raiding parties and skirmishing around the fort in that region. And the Royal Scots were frequently engaged in this skirmishing. The records indicate almost every day there were a handful of casualties, and there was skirmishing almost every day throughout the summer of 1813 and even into the fall. But turning to the winter of 1813, in December, the Americans finally abandoned Fort George River to Fort Niagara. And the picture on your screen now was a painting by Edward Walsh, and he painted that from Fort Niagara looking across the river toward Fort George. So that gives you an idea of how close these postings were. So after the Americans retreated, the Grenadier Company of the Royal Scots was ordered to assist in the capture of Fort Niagara. And at the same time, the three center companies of the regiment attacked the heights of Lewiston, again just across the river, to try to push the Americans back there. The Grenadiers of the regiment were praised by the colonel commanding the attack on Fort Niagara, saying, quote, "I have to express my admiration of the valor of the Grenadier Company of the Royals, whose zeal and gallantry were very conspicuous." And of the companies attacking Lewiston, the commanding general again noted the zeal and alacrity of Royal Scots and the 41st, who were there with them. And he noted that he only regretted the Americans retreating so quickly, so he didn't have more of an opportunity of leading these troops to victory. So these were the first major actions of the Royal Scots in the war, and they're performing fairly well so far. Now, the start of 1814 again found the Royal Scots scattered across Upper and Lower Canada. And so as the Americans increased their raid into Upper Canada, particularly from Detroit into southwestern Ontario or southwestern Upper Canada, the light company of the regiment was sent to the small town of Delaware, which is near London, Ontario, to try to stop some of these incursions. And on the night of March 3rd, Captain Stewart of the Royal Scots was sent word that a group of Americans was camped for the night on the Longwoods Road, which is the road that runs essentially from Detroit to Burlington Heights or Hamilton today. So the Americans had come in to Upper Canada on a raid to steal cattle and food to feed the people in Detroit. So the next morning, Captain Stewart sent the light companies of the Royal Scots and the 89th Regiment to attack this American camp on the Longwoods Road. So the following excerpt is from an officer of the 89th. So it doesn't describe in great detail the Royal Scots, but I think it's worth quoting to give you an idea of the conditions of the battle in March of 1814. So this is written by a lieutenant of the 89th, Lieutenant Pigot, describing the death of Lieutenant Graham, who was the commander of the 89th Light Company. And I mention that because the three pictures on your screen there are the mourning ring of Lieutenant Graham, probably belonging to his mother. And inside you can see the writing on the inside of the ring that gives a brief description of the Battle of Longwoods and his death. So this description from Lieutenant Pigot. Quote, "We were in America under the orders of General Drummond, and the flank company of the 1st and 89th Regiments were sent up the interior of the country to dislodge the enemy from a position he had taken up and strongly fortified. We commenced our march on a severe morning in the depth of winter. From the severity of the weather and the ground being covered with snow, our march was fatiguing in the extreme. When we came up with the enemy's works, a murderous fire was opened on us as we traversed the deep ravine that separated us from the heights he occupied. Every one of our officers, with the exception of Graham and myself, had been picked off by the concealed rifles of our opponents, and we alone remained to lead on to the attack. For a moment we placed ourselves under the slope of a hill to prepare for a desperate effort to carry the position, retreat or surrender being alike impossible. My gallant friend was rallying his men to the charge. Springing forward, he exclaimed, 'Now, my lads, follow me.' The next moment, 'Oh God,' escaped his lips, and he fell to the earth. The rest of us, reduced to 8 in number, were made prisoners by the enemy." So both the Royal Scots and the 89th took very high casualties in this battle. Not a significant number of prisoners, though. Most of the casualties were wounded, and obviously there were some dead, and many of those wounded died in the days and weeks later. But despite these casualties, both the Royal Scots and the 89th were praised for their attacks, quote, "made in the most gallant manner." So this is a nice segue. In our consideration of whether or not this was an elite regiment, it's important to know that the soldiers that made up this regiment were recruited in exactly the same way as every other regiment in the Army. And despite the name of the regiment, the soldiers were predominantly Irish. In the 1st Battalion, that's 41%, and then English, 30%. So Scots only made up 24% of the men, though interestingly, nearly 50% of the sergeants in the 1st Battalion were Scottish. I'm not sure why it would be. For the men, their median height was 5 feet 6 inches, which is exactly average for the Army. They did tend to be a little bit older than the average British recruit, with a large number of men in the early 30s, but also a lot in the early 20s. So I would suggest that that's probably because the men in the early 20s joined at Quebec when they were recovering, whereas the men in their early 30s had survived the West India Campaign. For the vast majority of the men whose previous occupations were known, they were listed as laborer, which is a general farm laborer, followed by weaver. And again, those are patterns that follow the British Army as a whole. And so all of these numbers suggest that from this perspective, the Royal Scots were no more elite than any other regiment. And in addition, once these men were in the regiment, they acted exactly like any other. So in a letter from, in a letter to Sir George Prevost, the Governor General of British North America, Lieutenant General Gordon Drummond wrote that the light companies of the 89th and Royal Scots needed to be removed from Delaware, as their behavior was more that of, quote, plundering banditti than British soldiers. So from this perspective, from the ordinary men in the battalion, it doesn't really seem like the Royal Scots are an elite regiment. They're just made up of the same men as everybody else in the British Army. So return to the formation. Following the Battle of Longwoods, the Royal Scots in the 89th were pulled back from Delaware, back to Burlington Heights, or near Hamilton today. In April, headquarters of the regiment were again moved to Fort George, and again detachments were spread all along the Niagara River that you can see on the map there. In July, the majority of the regiment was moved to Chippewa after the American forces crossed the Niagara River and captured Fort Erie. So this time you can see Fort Erie at the south end of the Niagara River. The Americans advanced north, and on July 4th, the rebuilt light company of the Royals skirmished with the leading elements. And the following day, the British commander Riel decided to push south down the Niagara Road and attack the American army moving north. The Royal Scots, alongside the 100th Regiment, attacked and faced disciplined fire from the U.S. infantry and artillery, and so they took very heavy casualties in this Battle of Chippewa. And one of the casualties in this battle was Wilson. He was wounded 7 times in the battle and left on the field dying. He was then attacked by a First Nations soldier with a knife, but Wilson somehow managed to fight off and kill his attacker. And then he was nursed by an Indigenous woman who kept him alive after being taken prisoner. And the painting that's on your screen now is supposed to be a painting of those events, though there are obviously some significant inaccuracies. For example, you can't see Niagara Falls from the battlefield. Captain Wilson actually survived the War of 1812. He went on to become a lieutenant colonel, a companion of the Order of Bath, and an adjutant of the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, where he died in 1868. So I bring up the story of Captain Wilson partly because I think this is a lovely painting and one of the few that really shows an individual in the Royal Scots. But also because the Battle of Chippewa is one of the few in the War of 1812 in which Indigenous people, particularly the Haudenosaunee, fought against each other. They fought on both sides with the Americans and with the British, and so both the people of the Haudenosaunee were fighting against their brothers, essentially. And I believe this is going to be a future talk for Heritage Days in the fall on our lecture series. So I mentioned that because I think that's a fascinating part of Canadian and Indigenous history. So hopefully you'll join us for that talk as well. Now, for the rest of the month of July, following the Battle of the Niagara campaign continued with marching back and forth along the Niagara River. The Americans advanced north and even beyond the town of Queenston and actually threatened Fort George at one point, but they decided to retire. And the armies met again at Lundy's Lane on July 25th. Now, interestingly, due to the companies arriving at different times, the Royal Scots actually fought in 3 different contingents in the battle, so they weren't fighting all together. All 3 detachments, though, were separately noted for their steadiness in the dispatches written by General Drummond. I should mention that General Drummond began his career as an ensign in the Royal Scots, but I'm sure that has nothing to do with his praise for the regiment. Now, between Chippewa and Lundy's Lane, the Royal Scots had been very hard hit in July of 1814. But because of their bravery in these actions and the capture of Fort Niagara the previous December, they were awarded the Battle Honor Niagara for this campaign. That would be the only battle honor that they would win in the War of 1812. Following the Battle of Lundy's Lane, the Americans retreated to Fort Erie, but the British did not immediately follow. So it was well spent by the Americans, improving the fort's defenses. And when the British finally arrived outside the walls in early August, they realized that this was not going to be an easy nut to crack, and they settled in for a lengthy siege. When the assault was finally ordered for August 15th, the Royal Scots were not initially involved in the attack plans, likely because of the heavy casualties that they'd suffered at Chippewa and Lundy's Lane. However, on the night of August 15th, two companies did make it into the attack. They were part of the force that attacked the Northeast Bastion with Lieutenant Colonel Drummond when he called for reinforcements. Unfortunately, this is when disaster struck and the bastion blew up, killing all the attackers in the area. It was a devastating blow to the British. The remaining 8 companies of the Royal Scots at this point advanced, but they were there just to cover the retreat. It was abundantly clear by this point that this attack had failed and it was not going any further. So they were just there to cover the retreat of any survivors. So the siege continued, but it was to little real effect. And eventually the British realized that with the incredibly bad weather, the wet season was settling in, disease was increasing, casualties were increasing due to the constant skirmishing, and the British finally decided it was time to retreat. Before this could happen, though, the Americans launched an attack from the fort on the batteries, a sortie. They quickly captured the advanced position, but they were counterattacked by several regiments, including the Royal Scots. I believe the 6th Regiment, the 82nd, the Glengarry Light Infantry, Fencible Regiment. There were several regiments involved in pushing back the Americans back into the fort. Now, these would be the last casualties of the war for the Royal Scots, but they had suffered mightily throughout 1814. When the war formally ended in early 1815, both the 1st and 4th Battalions were sent back to the UK. Remember, the 4th Battalion was in Quebec at this time. The following year, in 1816, the 4th Battalion was formally disbanded, followed by the 3rd Battalion the year after in 1817. Now, in the early 19th century, the 2 remaining battalions of the Royals served throughout the world throughout the 19th century, including in the Crimea, in China in the Opium Wars, and in South Africa at the end of that century. And in addition, the Royal Scots served with distinction throughout the 20th century at a wide variety of theaters. In World War I, the regiment increased to 35 battalions, and over 100,000 men served in the regiment between 1914 and 1918. They were awarded 71 battle honors and 6 Victoria Crosses in that war. And in World War II, approximately 10,000 more men served in the 4 battalions, earning a further 39 battle honors. And the Royal Scots would continue to serve around the world throughout the rest of the 20th century, anywhere that the British Army was stationed. On March 28, 2006, though, after 373 years of continuous service, the regiment was merged with 5 other battalions to become the Royal Scots Battalion, Royal Regiment of Scotland. So in 2006, they ceased to be their own regiment. Later that year, though, the battalion merged again to form the Royal Scots Borderers, 1st Battalion of the Royal Regiment of Scotland. So they ceased to even be their own battalion within the Royal Regiment of Scotland. And then one further blow, even this battalion has been disbanded as of last December. They are now reformed as the 1st Battalion Ranger Regiment. So from the oldest regiment in the British Army, they no longer have any connection to Scotland, and they no longer carry the title Royal Scots. So to conclude, we're going to return to our original question. In the early 19th century, are the Royal Scots an elite regiment? At the beginning, I said I would answer both yes and no. But I would like to look at one final area just before we finish. These are some of the officers of the Royal Scots in the early 19th century. Personally, I think they are absolutely stunning. They're elaborate, and they're entirely befitting an elite regiment. They're entirely unique. Nobody else has uniforms that look quite like this. So on the yes side, for them being an elite regiment, we have that the Royal Scots were the oldest regiment in the British Army. They were commanded by a royal, and the officers were equipped as such. They were dressed as an elite regiment. But on the other hand, the men of the Royal Scots were the same recruits as the rest of the army. More importantly, though, the senior command of the army did not treat the Royals in a special fashion at all. So I have to conclude that, yes, the men, especially the officers of the regiment, considered themselves to belong to an elite regiment. However, not everyone agreed. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Maybe quit sharing your screen while I have a couple of questions. So trying to sift through all these battalions, 4 battalions during the Napoleonic era. Can you give a recap again of where they were? So the 1st battalion prior to coming to Canada were in the West Indies?
Yes, absolutely. So the 1st battalion started in the West Indies and then came to Canada.
2nd battalion?
2nd battalion was in Egypt in that campaign, and then they were sent to India for 2 decades until the 1830s, actually.
Okay, and then 3rd battalion was in the Peninsular War and then at Waterloo.
That's right, with Wellington. Yep.
And then the 4th battalion was
mostly stationed at home. They were eventually sent to Holland and then to Quebec at the end of the War of 1812, but they didn't see any action there.
And that I find it curious. So you said the 3rd battalion was the holding battalion?
The 4th battalion was the holding
Oh,
battalion.
okay, good. Then that movement or their service was more reflective of what you'd expect in a holding battalion. All right, and then thinking of some letters I've seen doing my own research, the 1st battalion wasn't originally destined for Canada, were they? Were they being rotated home or moved to a different theater? But there was, I don't know, a regiment of French captives or something like that they thought weren't appropriate for service in North America, and so they switched them out for the Royal Scots. Or
So after serving in the West Indies for some time, as I said, they were devastated by disease, and I think the plan was to rotate them home. But they actually did, when the War of 1812 broke out, they were sent to Quebec, I think because they were there, they were handy. But the story of French prisoners of war, when they were inspected in, I believe, August of 1812, so they'd just gotten to Quebec, and they were told they were basically had a number of former French prisoners of war who had decided to serve in the British Army and sign up with the Royal Scots. And so they were actually told, yeah, Quebec City is not a great place for these people. They tend to be deserting a lot. So it was actually the Royal Scots that were full of French prisoners. And so I think they quickly shuffled them to Upper Canada soon after that.
okay, yeah, I recalled something like that in my readings. And then final question, during the Napoleonic era, the uniform of the Royal Scots, any of the battalions, did it incorporate kilts or bonnets?
No, that's a great question. So the Duke of Kent that I mentioned took a keen interest in his regiment, and he wanted to make them more Scottish. They looked exactly like any other English or Irish regiment, and he wanted them to be more Scottish. He wanted to put them in kilts and he wanted to put them in bonnets. And his brother, the Duke of York, just kept saying, nope, they are a lowland regiment, so we are not going to dress them as Highlanders. So they have little tiny markings of Scotland on their buttons and their cap badges, but they're almost indistinguishable from any other English county regiment or Irish regiment. They are dressed exactly the same way.
Wow. Okay. Thanks. Well, thank you for that, Chris. That was a great talk, and I hope our audience enjoys that. So.
Thank you so much.